The story of Margaret Collins began long before she ever set foot in Chicago, long before she ever carried a plate at La Maison Rouge, long before anyone had reason to underestimate her. It began in a small town in eastern Kentucky, in a house with a leaking roof and a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who had left before Margaret was old enough to remember his face. Her mother, Dorothy Collins, was the kind of woman who believed that poverty was a condition, not an identity, and she raised her daughter with a philosophy that would shape everything Margaret would eventually become. "You watch people, Margaret," Dorothy used to say while they sat together on their sagging front porch, watching the neighbors come and go. "You watch what they do, not what they say. You learn from everyone, even the ones who think they're too good to notice you. Especially them, because the people who don't notice you will show you exactly who they really are." Margaret absorbed that wisdom the way dry earth absorbs rain, and she carried it with her when she boarded a Greyhound bus at 28 years old with 2 suitcases and $87 and a dream she could barely articulate even to herself. Chicago was everything Kentucky was not. Loud and cold and overwhelming, full of people who moved too fast and spoke too sharp and seemed to have no time for a girl from the mountains who didn't know how to navigate a subway or order coffee without sounding like a tourist. But Margaret was not easily discouraged. She found a job at La Maison Rouge within her first week. Not because she had experience in fine dining, but because she showed up early for the interview, dressed in the best clothes she could afford from the Goodwill, and looked the hiring manager directly in the eye when she promised she would work harder than anyone else on the staff. The hiring manager, a woman named Patricia who would retire 3 years later and never know what Margaret would become, saw something in the young woman from Kentucky that reminded her of herself, and she took a chance. Margaret Collins had carried plates and wiped down tables at La Maison Rouge for 23 years after that first day, and in all that time, not a single person in that restaurant had ever suspected that the quiet waitress with the tired eyes and the sensible shoes was building an empire in the shadows. The restaurant was one of the fanciest establishments in Chicago, the kind of place where a single appetizer cost more than Margaret's weekly grocery budget, where senators and celebrities drank wine that was older than most marriages, where the crystal chandeliers alone were worth more than everything she had ever owned combined. She had started there when she was 28 years old, fresh off a bus from Kentucky with 2 suitcases and a dream she could barely articulate even to herself. And she was still there at 51, her feet swollen every night when she finally kicked off her shoes, her back screaming every morning when the alarm pulled her from too short sleep, her hands rough and cracked from chemicals and hot water and the endless cycle of service. 23 years of smiling at people who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. 23 years of perfect service and no recognition beyond the occasional nod. 23 years of watching the same wealthy customers tip generously when they were showing off for dates and stiff her when no one important was looking. The other servers at La Maison Rouge saw Margaret as a fixture, as reliable and unremarkable as the mahogany bar or the white linen tablecloths. Someone who had been there forever and would probably be there forever. Someone who had apparently made peace with her station in life and asked for nothing more than her hourly wage and whatever tips the customers deigned to leave. They could not have been more wrong. What none of them knew, what Bradley Mitchell certainly did not know when he grabbed her arm that night in March and screamed in her face that she was worthless, that she would die a waitress, that she was nothing and had always been nothing, was that Margaret had been paying attention the entire time, absorbing everything, learning the restaurant business from the inside out while they all assumed she was just another invisible worker waiting to collect her measly check. Bradley Mitchell was the general manager, 3 years on the job, convinced that the world owed him a throne simply because he had been born with the right last name and the right connections, and he had hated Margaret from the moment he arrived, though she never fully understood why. Maybe it was because she had been there longer than him, knew the menu and the wine list and the regular customers better than he ever would. Maybe it was because she performed her job with a quiet competence that made his own fumbling management look worse by comparison. Maybe it was because she refused to cry when he yelled at her, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, and that refusal drove him absolutely insane with a rage he could barely contain. The incident that changed everything started with something small, something that should have been forgotten within minutes. A busboy named Carlos, 19 years old and nervous on his 3rd week of work, bumped into Margaret while she was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, and one of the glasses tipped and fell, splashing expensive champagne on the shoes of a man who turned out to be a state senator dining with campaign donors. The senator laughed it off immediately, waved his hand, and said it was nothing. No problem at all. Accidents happen, and he even complimented Margaret on how quickly and gracefully she handled the cleanup. But Bradley Mitchell saw his chance, saw an opportunity to assert dominance, to remind everyone in the room who was in charge, and he came striding across that dining room with fire in his eyes and his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown to detonation. He grabbed Margaret's arm hard enough to leave bruises that would take 2 weeks to fade, and he screamed at her in front of 200 customers, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, his face red with a fury that seemed completely disproportionate to the crime. He told her she was pathetic. He told her she was a disgrace to the establishment. He told her she should be grateful that anyone let her work there at all. He told her she would die a waitress, that she was nothing, that she had always been nothing, that she would always be nothing. The crystal chandeliers seemed to tremble with the force of his voice. Every fork in that room stopped moving. Every conversation died. 200 pairs of eyes turned to watch a 51-year-old woman being humiliated by a man half her age with half her experience and none of her dignity. And Margaret stood there with her face burning and her arm throbbing and her heart pounding, and she did something that surprised even herself. She refused to cry. She had made a promise to herself years ago, during another moment of humiliation that she rarely allowed herself to remember, that no one would ever see her break, that her dignity was the one thing no paycheck could buy and no insult could steal, and she kept that promise even as Bradley's spittle landed on her cheek and his fingers left marks on her skin. He walked away eventually, smoothing his jacket like nothing had happened, and the dining room slowly returned to its normal hum of conversation and clinking silverware, and Margaret finished her shift with the same professional smile she had worn for 23 years. She drove home that night in her 15-year-old Honda Civic, the one with the cracked windshield and the passenger door that only opened from the inside. And she let herself into her small apartment and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without turning on the lights. Then she went to her closet and pulled out the folder she kept hidden behind her winter coats. The folder filled with spreadsheets and investment statements and ownership documents that told a very different story about who Margaret Collins really was. Because here was what Margaret had been doing all those years while everyone at La Maison Rouge thought she was just carrying plates and dreaming of nothing. She had been saving half of every tip she ever made, denying herself small pleasures and large ones alike, living on a fraction of her income while the rest disappeared into investment accounts that no one knew existed. And she had been investing in what she understood better than almost anyone in the city of Chicago: restaurants. Her first investment had come 12 years earlier, $10,000 scraped together from years of careful saving, placed into a struggling diner on the south side that everyone said was a lost cause, a hole in the wall that served breakfast to factory workers and would never be anything more. But Margaret had seen something in that diner that the so-called experts had missed. She had seen a loyal customer base. She had seen a location with potential. She had seen an owner who was exhausted not because the business was bad, but because she was trying to do everything herself. Margaret had offered not just money but advice, quiet suggestions based on everything she had learned watching La Maison Rouge operate. Ideas about portion control and supplier negotiations and staffing schedules that seemed obvious to her but revolutionary to the diner's overwhelmed owner. Within a year, the diner was profitable. Within 2 years, it had expanded to include a lunch service that packed the place every day from 11 to 2. And Margaret had taken her share of those profits and invested in another restaurant and then another, working her shifts at La Maison Rouge during the day and managing her growing portfolio at night, sleeping 4 hours on good days and 3 on bad ones. Building something in the shadows that no one could see because no one ever bothered to look twice at the waitress. By the time Bradley Mitchell grabbed her arm and screamed that she would die a waitress, Margaret owned stakes in 14 restaurants across Chicago. Her net worth was approaching $3 million, and nobody at La Maison Rouge had any idea. She looked at that folder on the night of the incident, at the evidence of everything she had built while they dismissed her as nothing, and she made herself a promise. Not revenge, not rage, but something quieter, something that would take time, something that felt right in her bones in a way that anger never could. She would wait. She would build. She would become so successful that Bradley Mitchell's opinion of her would become a footnote in the story of her life rather than its defining moment. And then, when the time was right, she would show him exactly who he had underestimated. The years after that night were a blur of patience and persistence. Margaret kept working her shifts at La Maison Rouge, kept smiling at customers, kept dodging Bradley's continued abuse, kept her secret hidden behind the same tired eyes and sensible shoes that had fooled everyone for so long. But every month her portfolio grew. Every year her net worth climbed higher. Every deal she made taught her something new about the business, gave her new connections, opened new doors that she walked through with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, even if no one else could see the path. By 2015, Margaret owned stakes in 32 restaurants across Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. Her portfolio had grown to $12 million. She had a reputation in certain circles as a savvy investor with an uncanny ability to identify struggling restaurants that could be turned around, though the people in those circles had no idea that their mysterious benefactor spent her days carrying plates and her nights poring over financial statements in a small apartment that still had the same second-hand furniture she had bought when she first moved to Chicago. By 2018, Bradley Mitchell had climbed his own ladder, though his ascent was built on connections rather than competence, on his family name rather than his own achievements. He had become a partner at the Mitchell Restaurant Group, the company founded by his grandfather that owned La Maison Rouge and 4 other high-end establishments across the city. And he walked through the world with the swagger of a man who believed he had finally arrived, who thought he was untouchable, who was certain his future was golden. But the economy had other plans. The restaurant industry began to shift in ways that Bradley, with his focus on appearance over substance, completely failed to anticipate. Consumer habits changed as younger diners rejected the stuffy formality of traditional fine dining. Rising costs squeezed profit margins that had always been thinner than the Mitchell family wanted to admit. Competition intensified as new concepts and innovative chefs attracted the attention that places like La Maison Rouge had once taken for granted. By 2020, the Mitchell Restaurant Group was drowning in debt. The 5 restaurants that had once been the crown jewels of Chicago dining were now bleeding money every month, hemorrhaging investors heading straight toward a bankruptcy that would wipe out 3 generations of Mitchell family legacy. Bradley did everything he could think of to save the sinking ship. He fired longtime staff members to cut costs, destroying institutional knowledge that could never be replaced. He cut corners on ingredients and service, driving away the loyal customers who had kept the restaurants alive for decades. He borrowed money from increasingly desperate sources, signing loan documents with interest rates that would have made his grandfather weep. Nothing worked. The ship was going down, and Bradley Mitchell was going down with it, and all his family connections and expensive suits and confident swagger couldn't change the fundamental reality that he had never actually learned how to run a business. And then, in October 2023, an anonymous buyer appeared with an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. $47 million in cash for the entire struggling group, all 5 restaurants, all the debt, all the problems, a clean slate and a way out. Bradley's lawyers reviewed the offer and found nothing wrong with it. His accountants ran the numbers and confirmed that the price was fair, even generous given the company's current condition. His family, exhausted by years of watching their legacy crumble, urged him to take the deal and walk away with what dignity remained. Bradley accepted within 24 hours without reading the fine print, without asking questions about who this mysterious buyer might be, without pausing to wonder why anyone would pay $47 million for a company that was worth half that on paper. He signed the documents in a lawyer's office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, and he walked out believing he had survived, believing he had won, believing that his luck had finally turned. He had no idea that his luck was about to run out in a way he could never have imagined. The following Monday, Bradley Mitchell showed up at La Maison Rouge for a meeting with the new owners, expecting to charm them with his knowledge of the business, to negotiate a consulting role that would keep him connected to the restaurants his family had built to prove that he was indispensable despite everything that had happened. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal grey one that his ex-wife had picked out years ago, and he had practiced his pitch in the mirror that morning, confident that his combination of family legacy and industry experience would be impossible to resist. He walked through the front door of La Maison Rouge with a smile on his face and a spring in his step, ready to begin the next chapter of his career. And then he saw who was sitting at the center table. The best table in the restaurant, the one reserved for senators and celebrities and people whose names appeared in society columns. The exact spot where he had grabbed Margaret's arm and screamed in her face all those years ago. A woman was sitting there alone. A woman with grey hair styled elegantly and hands that showed the evidence of a manicure for what was clearly the first time in a very long life. A woman wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than the best table's monthly revenue. It took Bradley several seconds to recognize her, because the woman he was looking at bore so little resemblance to the tired waitress who had occupied his peripheral vision for years. The furniture in human form that he had screamed at and dismissed and forgotten almost as soon as the words left his mouth. But then the woman stood up and something in the way she moved triggered a memory, and Bradley Mitchell's confident smile collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Margaret Collins walked toward him slowly, deliberately, each step carrying the weight of 23 years of patience, and she stopped exactly 3 feet away, close enough to see the recognition dawn in his eyes, far enough to maintain the dignity she had never lost. 23 years ago, Margaret said, her voice steady and calm. You grabbed my arm in front of 200 people and screamed that I would die a waitress. You told me I was nothing. You told me I had always been nothing. You told me I would always be nothing. Bradley's mouth opened, but no words came out. I have thought about that moment every single day since then, Margaret continued. Not because it hurt me, though it did. Not because it humiliated me, though it did that too. I thought about it because it reminded me every single day of who I was working to become. She paused, letting the silence stretch between them, letting him feel the weight of what was coming. I saved every tip I ever made in this restaurant. I invested in restaurants when everyone said I was crazy, when the experts told me a waitress had no business thinking she understood the industry. I built a portfolio worth $47 million while you were running this company into the ground. Bradley's face had gone white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled suddenly from water. And last week, Margaret said, I used every penny of that portfolio to buy your company. The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret watched as the full implications assembled themselves in Bradley Mitchell's mind. Watched as he realized that the waitress he had dismissed as nothing was now his employer, that the woman he had humiliated was now in control of everything his family had built. She could have gloated. She could have screamed at him the way he had screamed at her. She could have given him back every ounce of cruelty he had given her, with interest compounded over 2 decades. But Margaret Collins had not spent 23 years building an empire just to tear someone else down. I'm not going to do what you did to me, she said quietly. I'm not going to humiliate you in public or tell you that you're worthless or make you feel small. That's not who I am. That's not who I ever wanted to be. Bradley stared at her, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely confused, as if kindness in this moment was so unexpected that he couldn't process it. I'm going to use my new position to build something better, Margaret continued. To treat every employee the way they deserve to be treated. To create a workplace where no one ever feels the way you made me feel. That's my revenge, Bradley. Becoming someone you could never imagine. Building something you could never build. Succeeding in ways you could never succeed. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, plain white with simple black text, and she handed it to him. The HR department will contact you about your severance package. It's generous. More generous than you deserve, honestly. But I've learned over 23 years of waiting that kindness is not weakness. Kindness is the ultimate strength, and the best revenge is not cruelty, but becoming someone your enemies could never imagine. Bradley took the card with trembling fingers, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Shame. Not the performative shame of someone caught doing wrong and sorry only that they were caught. Real shame. The kind that comes from looking at yourself clearly for perhaps the first time in your life. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. I'm sorry for what I said, for what I did, for all of it. Margaret considered his apology for a long moment, turning it over in her mind, testing its weight and substance. I believe you mean that, she finally said, and I accept your apology. But Bradley, I don't need your apology to know my own worth. I never did. The only person who ever needed to believe in Margaret Collins was Margaret Collins herself. She turned and walked back toward the center table, toward the seat she had never been allowed to occupy in all her years of service, and she sat down with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every inch of her success. You can go now, she said. And Bradley, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I hope you become someone better than who you've been. I really do. He left without another word, and Margaret sat alone at the best table in the restaurant she now owned, looking around at the crystal chandeliers and the white linen tablecloths and the mahogany bar where she had spent 23 years being invisible. She was not invisible anymore. In the months that followed, Margaret transformed the Mitchell Restaurant Group into something new, something that reflected her values rather than the hollow prestige of the family that had built it. She renamed it the Collins Hospitality Group, a name that still made her smile every time she saw it on letterhead or business cards or the new signs that replaced the old ones outside each restaurant. She raised wages for every employee, from the dishwashers to the sommeliers, and implemented a profit-sharing program that gave everyone a stake in the success of the business. She created scholarship funds for staff members pursuing education, because she remembered what it was like to dream of something more while feeling trapped by circumstances that seemed impossible to escape. She promoted from within whenever possible, elevating the servers and cooks and managers who had been overlooked for years. the quiet, competent workers who reminded her of herself. And she never, not once, raised her voice at an employee, or made anyone feel small, or told anyone that they would never amount to anything. Within 2 years, her restaurants were more profitable than they had ever been under Bradley Mitchell's management. Within 5 years, her portfolio had grown to $90 million, and she had expanded beyond Chicago to cities across the Midwest, bringing her philosophy of dignity and respect to every establishment she acquired. The business press eventually discovered her story, and the headlines wrote themselves. The waitress who bought her boss's company, and from server to CEO, Margaret Collins' incredible journey, and revenge of the underestimated, how one woman built a restaurant empire. Margaret declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But she agreed to speak at a conference for women in business, standing on a stage in front of 3,000 people who wanted to know her secret, who wanted to understand how a waitress from Kentucky had become one of the most successful restaurateurs in the Midwest. There's no secret, she told them. There's just patience. There's just paying attention when everyone assumes you're not worth noticing. There's just believing in yourself when no one else does, and proving them wrong not through anger or revenge, but through success. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, seeing herself in so many of them. If you're being underestimated right now, if someone is telling you that you'll never amount to anything, if you feel invisible and overlooked and forgotten, I want you to know something. The view from the bottom is actually an advantage. You can see everything, you can learn everything, and no one suspects you're watching. The audience erupted in applause, and Margaret felt something she had rarely allowed herself to feel during all those years of patient building. Pride. Not pride in her money or her success or her revenge against Bradley Mitchell. Pride in who she had become. Pride in the path she had walked. Pride in the proof she had provided that anyone, regardless of their starting point, could become something extraordinary if they refused to give up. The story could end there, with Margaret standing triumphant on that stage. But the truth is that the most important part of her story happened months later, in a quiet moment that no camera captured and no journalist recorded. A young woman named Elena, 23 years old and working as a server at the flagship Collins Hospitality restaurant in downtown Chicago, approached Margaret one evening after the dinner rush had ended. "Miss Collins," Elena said, her voice nervous, "can I ask you something?" Margaret set down the financial reports she had been reviewing and gave Elena her full attention. "Of course. How did you do it? How did you go from being like me to being like you? How did you build all of this?" Margaret looked at the young woman standing before her, and she saw herself 30 years earlier, fresh off a bus from Kentucky with 2 suitcases and a dream, and she felt something unlock in her chest. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Let me tell you a story." She told Elena about growing up poor in Kentucky, about her mother's advice that poverty was a starting point and not a destination, about arriving in Chicago with nothing but determination and a willingness to learn. She told her about the years of saving, the first investment in the struggling diner, the slow, patient building of something from nothing. She told her about Bradley Mitchell and the night he screamed at her, about the choice she had made to channel her pain into progress rather than rage. And she told her about the moment of confrontation, about the unexpected power of kindness, about the realization that the best revenge was simply becoming someone her enemies could never imagine. When she finished, Elena was crying, and Margaret handed her a tissue with the same matter-of-fact kindness she had shown to countless customers over 23 years of service. "I'm going to do it," Elena said. "I'm going to save and invest and learn everything I can. I'm going to build something too." Margaret smiled. "I know you will. And when you do, I want you to find someone else who's being underestimated and tell them your story. That's how we change the world, Elena. Not through grand gestures or dramatic revenge, but through quiet persistence and passed along wisdom." Elena nodded, wiping her eyes, and Margaret saw something in the young woman's face that she recognized from her own reflection all those years ago. The spark of determination that nothing could extinguish. "Now go home and get some rest," Margaret said. "You have a lot of work ahead of you." Elena left, and Margaret sat alone in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built, and she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off a bus in Chicago 3 decades ago. She thought about all the nights she had fallen asleep at her tiny kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and investment reports. She thought about Bradley Mitchell's face when he realized who had bought his company. She thought about Elena, who would carry the torch forward, who would build her own empire and inspire someone else to do the same. And she understood finally that her story was not just about money or revenge or success. It was about the quiet power of patience. It was about the revolutionary act of believing in yourself when no one else does. It was about building bridges instead of burning them, creating opportunities instead of seeking vengeance, becoming better instead of becoming bitter. Margaret Collins had spent 23 years being invisible, and she had used that invisibility to build something that would last long after she was gone. That was her real legacy. Not the restaurants or the money or the headlines, but the idea she planted in Eleanor's mind and in the minds of everyone who heard her story, that anyone could become something extraordinary if they refused to give up. The best table in the restaurant, the one where Margaret now sat alone, had witnessed thousands of important meetings over the years, deals struck and relationships forged and celebrations held. But none of them mattered as much as the conversation that had just ended. The passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. The continuation of a story that had begun with a frightened young woman stepping off a bus and would continue through every person she had inspired. Margaret stood up, turned off the lights, and walked out of the restaurant she owned, into the Chicago night that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming. The city looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She was no longer the invisible waitress, the furniture in human form, the nothing that Bradley Mitchell had screamed about all those years ago. She was Margaret Collins, founder and CEO of the Collins Hospitality Group, proof that patience could build empires and kindness could conquer cruelty, and anyone at all could become something extraordinary. And somewhere in the city, Eleanor was going home to start saving her tips, to begin building her own future, to carry the torch that Margaret had carried for so long. The story continued. It always does. One patient builder at a time, one quiet revolution at a time, one impossible dream made real at a time. That was the secret Margaret Collins had discovered in 23 years of invisible struggle. And that was the secret she was determined to share with anyone who needed to hear it. Because the world was full of people being underestimated. And every single one of them had the potential to become something extraordinary. They just needed to believe it. They just needed to start. They just needed to refuse, no matter what anyone said, to give up. Margaret had done it. Eleanor would do it. And whoever was listening to this story, whoever felt invisible and overlooked and forgotten, could do it too. All they had to do was begin. The rest would follow. It always did. One tip at a time. One investment at a time. One quiet act of building at a time. Until the empire was complete. Until the dream was real. Until the waitress became the owner. Until the nothing became everything. Until the impossible became inevitable. Just like Margaret. Just like everyone who refused to stay invisible. The story continues, and now it's your turn to write the next chapter. 5 years after that conversation with Elena, Margaret Collins received a letter that made her cry for the first time in decades. It was from Elena, who had saved and invested and learned and built just as she had promised, and who was writing to announce that she had just purchased her first restaurant, a small Italian place in the suburbs that everyone said was a lost cause, a hole in the wall that would never amount to anything. I saw what you saw in that diner on the south side all those years ago, Elena wrote. I saw potential where others saw failure. I saw opportunity where others saw risk. And I thought of you, Miss Collins, and everything you taught me about patience and persistence and the quiet power of believing in yourself when no one else does. I'm going to make this place successful. I'm going to prove everyone wrong. And when I do, I'm going to find another young woman who's being underestimated and tell her my story, just like you told me yours. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Thank you for showing me that the view from the bottom is actually an advantage. The story continues, Mrs. Collins, and now I'm part of it. Margaret read that letter 3 times, sitting alone in her office at the Collins Hospitality Group headquarters, and she thought about her mother Dorothy and the wisdom she had shared on that sagging porch in Kentucky all those years ago. You watch people, Margaret. You learn from everyone, even the ones who think they're too good to notice you. She had watched, she had learned, and now through Eleanor and everyone she would inspire, that watching and learning would continue for generations to come. That was the real fortune Margaret Collins had built. Not the money, though there was plenty of that. Not the restaurants, though they were thriving. Not the headlines or the awards or the recognition that had finally come after decades of invisibility. The real fortune was the idea she had planted, the philosophy she had shared, the proof she had provided that anyone could become something extraordinary if they refused to give up. Dorothy Collins had passed away 15 years earlier, long before Margaret's success. But Margaret liked to think her mother knew somehow, liked to imagine Dorothy looking down from wherever she was and smiling at what her daughter had built. "I watched Mama," Margaret whispered to the empty office. "I learned from everyone, even the ones who thought they were too good to notice me. Especially them." And somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago, Eleanor was opening the doors of her new restaurant for the first time, carrying the torch that Margaret had carried for so long, continuing the story that had begun on a sagging porch in Kentucky and would continue for as long as there were people willing to believe in the quiet power of patience. The waitress had become the owner. The invisible had become extraordinary. The impossible had become inevitable. And the story, as Margaret had promised, continued. One believer at a time. One builder at a time. One impossible dream made real at a time. Forever.